Francis never intended to strike a deal with the devil. He'd told himself he would do anything to break the dam that blocked his mind and held his hesitant hand away from the canvas, but he didn't think anyone was actually listening to his pleas. For the 9th night in a row, he stared at his unfinished painting, a streak of cobalt amidst 2 pea-green blobs, meant to represent the twin peaks of St. Lucia. He remembered the lies he told his ailing mother. She wanted him to go to America to become a doctor, not a failing artist. "The Prime Minister will laugh in my face if I present you to him," Francis shouted at the canvas. He tossed his brush into the jar of murky water on his desk and stood from his seat, raking his fingers through his dark, knotted hair. His face turned red as he clenched his teeth and fantasized about tearing the canvas to bits. "Wouldn't that show them?" a soft voice whispered from the ether. Francis held his breath. An icy sensation trickled down his spine, standing the hairs of his neck on end. "Excuse me?" he replied, unsure whether or not the voice was coming from within his own head. "From a vacuum cannot come wealth, as a painting cannot paint itself," the voice echoed from behind him. Turning slowly, Francis balled up his fist in anticipation of needing to punch some homeless fellow who had snuck into his apartment while he was working. But behind him stood only his desk, his painting, and his easel. The shadows in the corner of the room weren't dark enough to hide a person, but still he watched them from his peripherals. "Who said that?" Francis asked. "I did," the voice replied. Francis took a step closer to the green and blue canvas and grazed the dried pigments with his fingertips. "Don't be afraid. You're not the first to be blessed by my voice," the canvas said. "You?" Francis muttered, his mouth left hanging agape. "My painting?" He jerked his arm away as the shrill voice began to speak again. "Aye, me. The dreams of Dali, the Muse of Monet, the hands of Cézanne. Who are you, Francis, the boy on the other side of the paint?" Unaware he was slowly backing away, Francis stumbled into his chair and gasped when it screeched against the floor. After regaining his composure, he picked up the glass of water that he had been drinking and held it close to his face, examining it and then giving it a sniff. "I'm a painter," he said. "A pretty shoddy one." "Well, I've never met a great artist who hasn't said the same. Say, why don't you pick up that brush there and let me help you create as they did?" Francis glanced at the jar of brushes on his desk. He thought of his mother and of the cautionary tales she would share when he was a child. She'd warned him of the dangers of voodoo and dark magic and to never accept treats from a witch, but he couldn't recall her ever saying anything about a painting that could speak. "Go on," the voice said. "I won't have you cut off your ear." "You can make me a great painter?" Francis asked. "I can make you the greatest painter." After pausing for only a moment, Francis plucked his brush from the dirty water and sat facing the possessed cloth. He took his palette in his hand and swirled the bristles of his brush into a glob of burnt umber and sap green. A photo of the mountains he wished to recreate hung over the window beside his easel. "Ah, the Pythons of St. Lucia. What a sight to behold," the voice said. "I saw them nearly every day before I moved to America," Francis recalled, "but I just can't seem to do them any justice." "Nonsense. Show me what you saw from your own mind. Pull the image out of your brain, give me your hand, and together we will bring it to life." Francis sighed. "Okay." He raised his brush and swiped it across the canvas. Shimmering leaves of tropical canopies and golden sands surrounded by emerald blue waves began to encompass his field of vision. His mind spoke no words. The only sounds were those of the humming island breeze filling his small apartment. Tube by tube of paint and stroke by stroke of his brush, the Pythons came to life. Francis worked as a vessel for his teacher, moving how he was compelled and unsure whether he was sharing the workload or not. Occasionally, the voice of the painting would utter words of encouragement. "You're doing great," it would say. "You'll be renowned beyond imagination." The canvas was filled, but Francis kept painting. The voice took him to his closet, where he gathered his stockpile of oils and acrylics and inks. The morning sun began to peek through the window, but in his fevered trance, he continued. "Like Picasso and Leonardo before, the universities will teach of the great Francis St. Clair." Soon, the walls of the tiny room were transformed into wispy cotton clouds and dense island jungle. He painted the floor, blade by blade and pebble by pebble. The furniture dripped with new color and disappeared into the expanding mural. Violet half-moons had formed beneath Francis's eyes, and his sandpaper tongue rubbed sores into his lips. He swiped his brush against his palette, but at last it came up dry. He stood there staring at what he had done, his beautiful masterpiece that surrounded him. If not for the choking aroma of turpentine, Francis might have thought he'd returned to his birthplace. "Hello!" he called out. He swallowed as nausea began to creep into his belly. His eyes stung, and he wondered when he last blinked. "Are you there?" It was silent. Slipping along the floor, Francis made his way to where his door once was. He patted the damp walls in search of the doorknob, but it was no longer there. The walls were smooth and buttery, and he slid along them in a panic, searching for any way out of the beautiful box he'd helped create. "Help! Somebody help me!" he screamed. His fists pounded the walls, splattering a rainbow of colors all around him. Suddenly, the colors on the wall he was beating began to run. The paint flowed to the floor, and as it did, a new image took its place. Francis's eyes grew wide, and he dropped to his knees. It was his apartment, and he was standing there looking back at himself. He reached out his hand, but it was stopped by the transparent wall. "I lied to you, Francis," his body said to him in the painting's voice. "What do you mean?" Tears began to gather in his eyes. "What's happening?" "When I told you that a painting couldn't paint itself, I wasn't completely forthcoming." Francis stood and pressed against the wall with all of his strength. "Please, let me out of here. I don't need to be a painter. I should have listened. I'll go to medical school, please." He could see himself smiling back at him with a terrible grin. "Do not fret. Now everyone will know our name." He raised his hand, and with one stroke of his brush, covered the wall with paint, and locked away the great Francis St. Clair.